This. Let's just take a look at a story prepared yesterday in terms of the IMF explainer, as we get to know why Kenyans are furious over the new IMF loans to Kenya. Well, KTN's Zabi Agina explains why many are outraged over this new loan, which is meant to assist the country at a time the Kenyan economy continues to contract, with the Jubilee administration turning a blind eye to the rising debt levels. Take a look.
It has been a rough week for the National Treasury, as well as staff at the International Monetary Fund in Washington, D.C., in the United States. The internet has been awash after Kenyans kicked off a social media campaign dubbed "Stop Loaning Kenya" and signed the petition, all in an attempt to challenge the government's unquenchable loan accumulation spree. Well, as this campaign goes on, one would ask, why are Kenyans directing their anger to the IMF and not Parliament or the head of state?
Taxes will increase, automatically impact on our household level. Secondly, our business will collapse automatically because more things, people will not be able to purchase goods because of escalating debts, and also the taxation issue which will be affecting their households.
Isha ni affect kwa sababu sahi cost of living iko juu. Si wenyewe tumeshazoea mtu anakutolea hadi 500, unaenda nyumbani unakula unajua hiyo. Sahi hata mtu akikupea mbao ni Mungu.
Now, let's get a clear understanding how the IMF works. The IMF was created in 1945 to act as a global lender to countries that were in financial distress, such as economic recession and war. The global lender works on a country-by-country specific program that are negotiated and approved if a country commits to honor the IMF's conditions. The latest loan of 255 billion shillings is meant to assist Kenya meet its budget deficit, as well as stabilize the economy, which has been severely ravaged by the COVID-19 pandemic. Kenya's budget for 2020-2021 financial year stands at 3.2 trillion shillings. This means that, going by the revenue collection figures, the country has a budget deficit of about 840 billion shillings, which must be plugged by sourcing for funds from the international lenders at affordable rates.
When people seem to have money, they seem to spend a lot, and inflation creeps in. Then the exchange rate also goes a little bit haywire, and therefore the IMF has to come in to stabilize those short-term shocks.
IMF came the first time. The prescriptions that were given to our government were very painful. People losing jobs, people being retrenched, people being given golden handshake, and people remember that suffering.
Kenya's total public debt is standing at 7.35 trillion shillings, which is 7 times what the President Kibaki-led administration borrowed in its 10 years in power. Of significant importance with these loans from the IMF is the conditions they come with. For example, as Kenya prepares to access these funds, the country has accepted to increase revenue collection by introducing new taxes to ensure there are no revenue shortfalls. And these are the outcomes that have got Kenyans angry with the government, maintaining we must borrow to finance infrastructure projects such as roads, hospitals and schools. Other conditions include strong governance of public institutions, which will see a major reduction in the public wage bill. This means the government will have to retrench employees in the civil service to tame the ballooning wage bill, which is pegged at over 700 billion shillings. This will result into job losses and increased taxes. Kenya is presently out of options to borrow from commercial lenders, and thus the reason why the country has to play by the rules set out by the IMF or risk falling into an economic recession. The structural adjustment programs being championed by the IMF are not new to Kenya. In the early 1980s, the country was put on the same path as IMF and the Bretton Woods institutions called for austerity measures and privatization of state-owned enterprises to stabilize the economy. Back in 2015, when Kenya sought financial support from the IMF, the country had to increase value-added tax in order to access a 68 billion shillings credit line. As the country navigates through the COVID-19 storm, The anger by Kenyans to the IMF could just be misguided. Abiagina, KTN News.
All right, that story by Abiagina sort of paints a picture into the role of IMF, even as Kenya has just secured that 256 billion shillings roughly loan to Kenya. And it will come with a raft of conditions. So allow us to delve deeper into this particular matter, even as we plug into the frustration on social media and what it actually means going forward in terms of the debt burden in the country. Joining us in studio to help us discuss on this matters, Stephen Mwakesi, who's a public policy analyst. We're also joined by Dr. Churchill Saoke, a governance expert, and Bunyasi Sakwa, via way of Zoom, Nambale Member of Parliament, who's also an economist. And by virtue of that, let me start with you, Bunyasi Sakwa. I mean, Kenya is not the only country that sort of borrows in order to fulfill certain obligations. The devil in the detail is we should actually borrow, incur debt, and use this debt to spur growth in the economy. I dare ask, is this the case so far? Because perhaps this is why there's so much resentment towards this particular loan.
Thanks very much, Jesse. I'm glad that there is resentment and anger, but it's completely misdirected. Let me start by saying the IMF is a public institution owned jointly by almost all of the countries of the world. There are a few that are not members. I think North Korea is one and a few old ones. But of course, it is probably more dominated by the richer countries, the so-called Western countries. That's also we should agree. But its very genesis, as you said at the beginning, was to try and stabilize the economies ravaged by the Second World War, to enable them to pursue growth policies. And to pursue those growth policies, they set up the World Bank at that time, because the IMF was not an institution for promoting growth, but for stabilization, principally. And the World Bank was the one that would pick up and deal with issues of poverty, issues of how to accelerate infrastructure and so on. Now, in the case of Kenya, everybody has seen this coming. I think it's just that maybe the awareness levels in the eyes of the public had not been made properly. What has led us to the IMF has been the way we have handled the economy internally. And we have handled the economy internally in such a way that our expenditures far exceed our revenues. And by the way, revenue is a polite word of saying tax, what you get out of taxes. If you use tax, if you say increase revenue, essentially you're talking about increasing taxes, most ordinary revenue most of the time, but that's not a very palatable word to use. So we say revenue increase, that's really increasing taxes. Mm-hmm. The IMF is like a surgeon. If they find that you have diabetes and one of your legs is getting gangrene, they might say, let us cut it off. And they'll cut it off. You can't cry and say, you can't cut my husband's, or my son's, or my daughter's, or my so-and-so's leg, because that's the nature of the treatment. They are usually of assistance of last resort. That governments have tried all other means of stabilizing their economies, bringing in balance their revenues and expenditures, and have failed. And they fail usually because they don't have the political will to cut expenditures where they should, or sometimes to increase revenues, increase taxes when they should. So when they go to the IMF, the things that they knew need to be done, and the economists know that, they get announced as if it's IMF that has told us we must do. We should ask the government, what is it you wanted to do? IMF has said this, what is it that you wanted to do? And when they negotiate, that's exactly what happens. The IMF says, these are your issues as we have seen them, what are you going to do about it? And they come up usually with half-hearted measures because they are afraid of reactions from the public, and IMF comes out much more specifically. For instance, we have been talking about KQ for a long time. How can our airline be incurring such deep debt? And we refuse to talk about ways of fixing it. We keep saying it's our national, it's our pride, we must give them money, and so on. Now, that's not the kind of thing that helps. Kenya Airports Authority is not liquid, but it's heading there. And there are many other projects. KPLC, for example, a monopoly, which charges almost what they wish, is now saying they do not have the money. And we would be paying, if I come from this year, we would be paying for inefficiency. We are out of power most of the time. So, and our economy, one of our lack of competitiveness, is because of energy costs and so on. They are not all to be blamed on KPLC, but certainly it's one of the master inefficiencies in this economy.
Okay.
So we are at a point in which our options are going to be painful, whichever way we look at it. And we knew this. All economists of this treasury, our treasury, are sharp people, I know that. But they just did not have the courage. The CS treasury kept saying, oh, this time we have a loan with IMF. We set the conditions. It's not IMF. I'm surprised. I've seen his column in The Nation today. He doesn't now justify what conditions they set. Obviously, he was trying to soften the blow. But I think that where we are, a figure point is not the right thing. We can say in managing an economy, you need a certain breadth, certain spectrum of management skills that you should play all the time. Don't wait until it gets completely out of hand to call in the IMF. You can deal with other developing institutions and fix it, but you must face the music. We have not been doing that.
Okay.
So I really find, as an economist, a rather disappointing thing that now the public thinks IMF has brought. No, it's us who got ourselves there. And we do not, if we have a better way of solving it, we should tell IMF not that, but this. We're not doing that. Just say. Okay. I really think it's misguided.
Okay, so, I mean, the pointing fingers and the public outcry might point to the growing appetite of the government in terms of new loans. But be that as it may, according to IMF, the government has committed to audit 9 key parastatals and reform them. Hence my next question. Let me come with you, Mwakesi. The importance of the structural adjustment loan right now. I've had comments from economists that we can't afford to walk away from the IMF. And we've just had Bunyasi Sakwa mention that the public outrage might be wrongly placed in terms of pointing fingers at the IMF. Talk to us about the importance and the timeliness of this structural adjustment loan, even as these key parastatals are set to be reformed.
Jesse, I think I agree that Kenyans are really raising this frustration because they feel every announcement coming out of the National Treasury is a request for additional money to plug in a deficit in terms of our debt and even debt refinancing. Mm-hmm. We had an ambitious project as a country when the Jubilee administration came in to do massive infrastructure projects in rail and road and also in energy. And this is what we're suffering from now because we were creating a high expenditure, but there was a very high, continuous dip in revenues for the country. And this led us to a position where we are at right now. To go to the IMF is even exacerbated more by the fact that last year we had to go through what we're calling the corona pandemic. And what had to happen is that the government still had its infrastructure projects still going on, but at the same time, the revenues had to take a dip because we had to take some revenue-cutting measures, such as lowering of taxes. And this, in effect, has led to a position whereby we are somewhat stuck. The other important thing that we also need to understand is that the government had to take additional measures from what was normal to be able to cushion Kenyans during the pandemic period. We saw that there was an additional expenditure that was coming through the Ministry of Health. There was need for social support mechanisms such as giving money to the elderly and vulnerable families. There was need also to go about paying for pending bills that were accruing, and we needed that money to help people who are already doing business with government. And then there was the issue of VAT refunds. So much of the money that we went to the IMF for in the year 2020, we already consumed it. That's about 73 billion. And so we needed to go for more in order to sustain ourselves going forward. Mm-hmm. And out of this, the IMF had some conditionalities. And what's very important, Jesse, to note is that the Kenyan government actually went and said these are the things that we are committing to ourselves. They were not necessarily just pushed by the IMF. They went ahead and said that. And one of the key issues that they raised was the issue of restructuring our state-owned entities. We have 9 state-owned entities that are completely bleeding us dry in terms of their balance sheets looking completely awkward. And some of them are completely exposed because if you look at the way the loan for the SGR was structured, they were expecting revenues from the feasibility study coming from KPA and Kenya Railways. Now we are not producing those kind of revenues. So we need to go and look for money to be able to plug these deficits that these particular state corporations are undergoing. So I find that the purpose of these particular adjustments is not just out of the ill will from IMF, but it is out of being able to enable Kenya to become more disciplined in how it consumes the resources that it has. One of the key requirements, even from the discussions with IMF, has been that we need a serious project management unit, whereby we can really observe of the projects that we have. Are we getting value for money? You can find out of the Kenyan government, 4,000 projects have been budgeted for and have been put money for. Yeah. But 555 of these have been found to be not working, non-performing, completely dead. Now, these are the kind of projects that we need to remove from our books. So it's a more an inward-looking kind of conversation that the Kenyan government needs to have and start saying that wherever our expenditures are not yielding value for money for the loans that we are borrowing, then we need to put an end to them. And it will mean that we'll have to tighten our boots and we have to become more serious in terms of how we look at how we do our budgeting. One point that I need to mention is that currently at the moment, we are looking at a deficit of, in terms of GDP numbers, 8.1%. In terms of plugging that deficit between revenue and our expenditure. Okay. When ideally, if you look at what the Parliamentary Budget Office is saying, we should be at around 3%. So it means going forward in terms of our budgeting as a country, we need to stop our appetite of expenditure and move more into a way whereby we are realistic about the revenues that we are going to have and work within we live within our means. Because as you see, from 2016, we were very realistic in terms of our revenues by the time we were presenting our budget. There was only a deficit between actuals and our estimates of only 5%. Now, the budget that we are presenting in this financial year, there is a difference of about 21% from what we are estimating to be able to get and what we actually get in terms of revenue. Right. So this lack of ambitiousness by our treasury mandarins has really put us in a place whereby we imagine we can spend money that we already do not have. So it demands that we become more disciplined. Be clear that we can only spend on what we are actually collecting, not being too ambitious.
Okay, so ambition in this case might be a little bit too much. Daktari, let's talk about how exactly we got there. Correct me if I'm wrong. A debt represents future taxes, one way or the other. Article 109 to Article 112 provides provisions of management of taxes, of debt, and Parliament, in one way or the other, has the authorization role. How did we get here? Who is to blame for the ballooning wage bill?
Well, there are many things that we have to appreciate. First, as my colleague has said, the whole question of investments that have been made before, and some of which have not been able to bring up revenue. That is, when you get a loan, you get a loan in the hope that this loan is going to bring back and pay back itself. So if it doesn't pay back itself, then that becomes a problem, and you end up requiring more loan to repay back that. So I think that the monies that we got initially that were used in investment on infrastructure, on the areas that were the key focus of the administration, and that which have not been able to pay back and plow back in terms of revenue regeneration is one of the key issues. And of course, the other thing is the aspect of the impact of the COVID-19, and we have to appreciate that the reduction, some of the tax measures that the president had given to cushion the public from the pandemic, especially last year, had a huge impact on the reduction of the tax base in terms of revenue regeneration. And so you then end up in a scenario where you are not able to pay back this loan as per the obligation in terms of the terms and conditions. But then, there were initially, when you look at the Kibaki administration, there was a lot of focus on local debts. So where he was getting debt from the local financiers. But then there are terms, sometimes the terms and conditions makes governments to see the need to get the loans from outside. If the rates are high and the terms and conditions are too stringent, then the foreign debt then becomes the only option. Okay. But then I think it is important, Jesse, to know that it is not bad to be in debt. It is not bad for a country to be in debt. I mean, countries are in debt. When you look at countries like Japan, they are almost, when you look at their debt to GDP, is about 234, is the highest, followed by Venezuela. I think in Africa, Sudan is the highest, around 124. Kenya, we are around 65%. Our neighbors in Uganda is at 45%. I think the key thing that we need to be thinking about now, and we need to be putting pressure on our governments, is, well, you are getting the loans. Where do you use these loans? How accountable? You know, you need to be the accountability on how these loans are being used for is very significant, because it will be very unfair to get, especially to the future generations, if we are getting loans today to pay our current expenditures, because we will be taking the problems to the future generations instead of us investing for the future generations. So I think that this is the thing that the public actually need to take keen interest on, because, you know, apart from the Bretton Woods institutions, World Bank being one of them, being there to cushion governments and their member states who have crippling economies, they're also in business. And so, you know, they will work in public interest, but they will also be driven by the whole question of wanting to do business. And so it is incumbent in the citizens to ensure that their governments are accountable in terms of using the loans that they get from the foreign debt more properly.
Okay, let's talk about accountability. Even as you perhaps answer to the question on the role of Parliament in terms of their authorization role, Bwana Bunyasi, talk to us about the accountability issue, because it seems the lack of accountability in one way or the other has led to the country sinking into this debt abyss. Talk to us about it.
Thank you very much, Jesse. First of all, I think we must really be direct about this. When you have a situation like ours, where you have the high debt we have, and if you get equivalent of daily borrowing, if the annual borrowing, if you simplify that and say, what does it equal to in daily borrowing? And you find that it exceeds, it's about perhaps 2-point-something billion, near 3 billion a day. And then waste, including theft and graft, are another 2 billion, almost as much as what we are actually borrowing. That's really a double jeopardy as it is. We must confront theft and wastage. Why do those matter? They matter because you take away money from the priorities that have been perhaps calculated and estimated to bring a certain amount of growth and impact to the economy. They get directed in ways that nobody knows what the impacts might. There will be some impacts, but they cannot be measured and they cannot be contained in terms of planning and economy. And we cannot be softy on this. You see, for example, as has happened with the medical supplies and the COVID ones with KEMSA, things are now off the headline, and the guys are still enjoying steak dinners, as we say in some places. I think we are too soft on this. We need to be tougher. Now let's go back to why we end up here. We need to look at the pipeline. There must be a pipeline that's critically important for achieving the goals we are setting. It can't be something that is a result of the balance of power, as it were, in the system. So we get what I would call sort of pride projects, or projects that indicate who has more power where. That's really where we are going off. It doesn't look like we are managing it well. Kibaki did manage it by being tight on what goes into the pipeline for funding. And as it were, then he did not rush to grow the budget size for us to claim that we are the largest power in Eastern and Central Africa combined. That kind of thing doesn't help us. I think we just need to be lean, mean, and focused. And there we are not being lean, mean, and focused, and that's a real problem. Now, people give examples of how other countries' economies are managing with the higher debt levels. I must speak on this one. You don't want to live in Venezuela. No, I can tell you. But you might want to live in Japan. Japan's GDP is about half of their gross national product, meaning that 50% as much again, of their economy is derived globally from the fact that they are a very globalized economy. The Toyotas we produce in Kenya count to Japan's GNP as well. The Toyotas they produce in the US, and whatever exports they are doing all over the world. that external aspect of their national growth, we call it gross national product, is about twice that of the GDP. So they're in a position in which servicing these debts is part of their normal operations. Plus, the yen is also a reserve currency, not as big as the dollar, it's a reserve currency. And when everybody was detonating their loans in your currency like they do with Americans, whose debt to GDP is also very high, they can, in theory, just expand the dollar supply, and they can service their debts. They don't quite do that because there are other implications of it. But it's different from us, who are in a little window, a little angle, dependent on the screws we need to deal with in our economy. People say needles, just to give anecdotal examples. On imports, each of those things is a leakage to our system. We outfinance UK jobs, Chinese jobs, or American jobs for us to do the little things we do here. We can't get there unless we seek efficiency internally, we begin to grow our economy from the resources we have got, and we import only what we need to be able to do more. And we are not doing that. We don't have a degree of economic nationalism and search for efficiency. Too loose-ended. We can't stop Mitumbas because our people will complain. But we can then not expand our textile sector as we should have, or shoes, or other things and so on. I think we need to get much more consciousness in dealing with these things.
Okay, even as you speak of consciousness, when we come back, we'll interrogate the accountability aspect. But consciousness, and I think Kenyans might ask this question in terms of raising the statutory debt limit of 9 trillion Kenyan shillings. Treasury has already petitioned Parliament, so we'll talk about the consciousness of that particular move going forward, even as we interrogate the lack thereof of accountability in terms of our debt management. Do stay with us. You're watching Morning Express. We'll be back in a few.